Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the last regular war report for the year, and possibly the last war report for the year. We're arranging our big year-end show, trying to figure out the exact details on that when that's going to be out. But we're expecting within the next week or so on which side of the New Year is going to be. We're not quite sure yet, but we figured there's enough news to give us a regular episode in between then. And we're just
Yes.
hot off the heels of our very interesting pre-show conversations that would get us nuked from orbit if we even brought 1/10 of what we said on the air. So I'll leave it to
Yeah.
you. Maybe one day we will get that Pidgeot exclusive episode, and you guys can really hear what we sound like unfiltered. But until that day comes, we have plenty to cover, starting in Ukraine. So I'll hand it over to you, GSP, if you'd like to
All
give us a
right.
rundown.
Thank you very much. So I'm a bit all over the place because I've put together 3 days worth of map updates over a 4 day period. So bear with me. This is going to be a little bit all over the place. But why don't we begin with Kurachovo? There's been some major developments there. Now, as you can see from this map, all those string of villages along the Vovcha River have been taken by the Russians, and towns like Hanivka were taken a little while ago, but also Konstantin Polovska was also taken. The Ukrainians did push in here with some of their elite units, and the Russians were afraid that a counterattack was inevitable. But what it seems to be now, the case seems to be that the Ukrainians are not going to mount a counterattack here. The elite units will go into an entirely defensive role. Um, in other words, they're not going to look for the Russians to have spread themselves too thinly in their advance, right? And they will take over a lot of the lower quality, untrained troops, as it were. So, if we look at this map, you can see that essentially, Korakovo, the town, is taken. What is left now is the industrial area. Um, I did have a map of that, but it's still you can see that there is still a rather large salient. But you notice that the fortifications south of Karakovo, more than half of them were taken since the last show, and now there's only about a third of those fortifications that are left. Um, why don't we go to the next slide? This gives you an idea of what the Russians are doing, and it gives you an idea where Korakovo is in relation to Pokrovsk. So, as you can see, Pokrovsk is circled in red at the top of the frame, and the top arrow is pointing towards Dnepr, the oblast of Dnepr, where you can find the town of Dnepropetrovsk. And the Russians are going to be moving around those series of fortifications that you see that that run parallel to the line I've drawn. The other line, the line at the bottom, is the directions that the Russians are going to go after in order to squeeze out that pocket, that salient of the Ukrainians. They're going to move in a direction from north to south instead of head on, and that's basically what they've been doing, for several months now. They've increased the size, and now they're like within like 15 kilometers of the oblast border with Dnepropetrovsk. The next slide is a bit of a close-up of Petrovsk to give you Pokrovsk to give you an idea of. Today there was only some minor movements by the Russians, as you can see, but that gives you an indication of where Pokrovsk is, and that line, the amount of territory that the Russians are gobbling up is moving westward, and it's going to keep moving westward because there is a one of the roads that leads to supplying Pokrovsk kind of runs parallel with this salient that the Russians are developing. The next slide will give you a better idea. It might even, I think it's actually railroad tracks, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, so in the next slide, you can see that there's been a tiny bit of gain that the Russians have had around Novovasilovka. And as you can see above it, there is a town called Udachny. Udachny is located on railroad tracks, and the Russians will want to use that not only to stop supplies going into Pokrovsk, but use it as a line of advancement against Pokrovsk. But first, they have to get there. You can see that in the bottom of the not but below where the territory has been gained, um, or rather, I'm getting mixed up. I'm focusing on the small area that they took today, in Novovasilovka. Um, Beneath that, you can see there's a string of square-shaped trenches. Those are most likely for artillery. So they're not really well designed necessarily for infantry. Anyways, um, adjacent to that is more territory that the Russians took today as well. The blow up, the next slide, gives you an idea of, of the territory that's been taken. Novo oh Boże, trudno. Novozayevtevka. Even I can't do this one. That's really hard. Now the red line and the red and yellow line are over it, so I can't see some of the letters. So I'm trying to wing it. Anyways, but here you get a better idea of the kind of trench network that's been developed. So some of these trenches are more for artillery. As far as I know, they're on higher ground. The next shot is you can see that the Russians are encroaching around Novovasilovka, which is just south of Pokrovsk. All these villages will be important to take first before they move onto the road and railroad tracks that lie north of them. And lastly, this is more in the eastern section at the Shenske. The Russians took that village about 2 days ago, and now they've expanded. They've gone over there's a small river there, and so now they're fighting on the other side of the bank. You can see that they're facing some of the trench networks. You can see these trench networks are more designed for infantry based on their design. Next, we move to Chasiv Yar. There's been some advancements by the Russians, both north of Chasiv Yar and in Chasiv Yar. But now we have confirmation that the Ukrainians did recapture the industrial plant in the middle of Chasiv Yar. But let's begin with the situation north of Chasiv Yar in this blowup. This is in Grigorivka. So they've finally taken all of Grigorivka. You can see that to the left of it, winding its way around, is the canal. That is a canal that stretches for many hundreds of kilometers further east and north towards Seversk. Now, the Russians have made some gains in the Seversk direction. It's just farmers' fields right now. It's not a tiny gain, but it's not a big gain by any means. I didn't want to post it because it's an area that the Ukrainians control very well. It's kind of like the general who's responsible for the Seversk direction deserves a medal, which we've said many times on the show. And the general who's responsible for the Russians advancing towards Pokrovsk from Avdiivka, he deserves his medal. These are the sort of the two best commanders of this war. So yeah, if you wanted to, I don't know if you've shown the area around Grigorivka that the Russians captured. That's the blow up.
Yeah, I
Uh,
can zoom in on that one.
yeah, zoom in on that one, and then finally we go to Chasiv Yar proper. Um, this map will show you the areas that the where the Russians have advanced since last week, and the red outline is what they've advanced today. And you can see that kidney shape, um, on an angle, on an oblique angle outline in yellow filled with blue. That is the plant that the Ukrainians retook from the Russians. The Russians will, what they'll do is they'll continue moving eastward, taking over these residential areas before they start moving southward. I think what they're going to do is try to basically cut off the plant completely. Now, there's rumors that there's anywhere from 150 to 200, maybe 225 Ukrainian fighters in the plant now. This plant is smaller than the one in Korachovo, but it's not by any means a small facility. So you can see that the Russians have made some gains in the forest in the bottom right hand corner. They've made some gains in the dashes areas, but for now they're moving westward, and the area just below the industrial plant is where the Russians have to hold in order for the pincer to work. So that's for Chasiv Yar. Next, we go further north, and we're in Liman, Kremenaya, and Terny region. The Russians have made some gains in Terny region. Now, this overall map gives you an idea of what the Russians are trying to do. Okay, so they're going, that arrow going straight down is the Zherebets River, and it's going towards a forest, the Serebryansky forest, which the Ukrainians were very successful in the second half of the year, particularly in the fall, in regaining a lot of the forest patch. And so the Russians are kind of like where they started from. A lot of this was also that updates were not forthcoming from either side, and it may have been that the Ukrainians had recaptured this area many months ago, not like in September or October. In any case, we've gone over many times why for the Russians it's difficult to get their UAVs working in this area, and why it's easier for the Ukrainians, because the Ukrainians simply just have more villages that are closer. In any case, so the Russians are moving south towards there. The next slide will show you just a bit of a close-up. You can see the area where the Ukrainians retook the forest from the Russians, and you can see the general direction that the Russians would have to do. This is a big order, in my opinion. This will not be an easy area for the Russians. I think the best I can hope for within the next few months is to continue moving south, like the arrow at the top, and secure this area before they go any further. So, in other words, take Terny, which they nearly have, and then take Yampolivka, which is the next village south of it. And then you have Vosnetsky Kram and Torske, which are south of it. But Yampolivka would be the immediate order that would have to be done. And that's where they would have to position themselves. It will not be easy because, again, there's very few villages on the eastern side of the river in this area. And of course, the bottom arrow just gives you an idea of the kind of work that would be waiting for the Russians. I don't think this is an area that the Russians, um, they've had a lot of setbacks here. I don't know how prioritized it really is. So ignore the next slide, Constantine, because it's too similar in scale to the previous one. Yes, this one is good. So this gives you an idea of the territory the Russians gained today in the Terny region. So you can see that they control over half the village. This is an area where they've had footholds before and they've been kicked out. This time, I have a feeling it will work. Mainly because it seems to be in the last month that wherever the Russians have been kicked out, eventually they do return and take it. When we get to Kupyansk, this will be demonstrated. So I told you this was going to be all over the place. So now we're going to jump way north and way west to Kursk and Suzhta. As you can see in this overall map, you see the territory that the Russians have gained in the last week. Suzhta is the area in the Kursk region that the Ukrainians have taken has been reduced by 60%. There's lots of articles now admitting there was even a Ukrainian mill blogger who was quite open that going after Kursk was a mistake, and that it did not stop the Russians from moving in the Eastern Front. I've also heard that, for instance, that that you know the Russians in many ways, like, of course it's an embarrassment for the Ukrainians to be in Kursk. I get that, but if they could come out quickly, what would the Ukrainians do? Would they focus on Donetsk? I don't think so. I think they would try somewhere else on the front line in the north. They would not give up on invading Russian territory.
No, the
You know,
Ukrainians are not acting conventionally at this point. I won't necessarily
yeah,
say not rationally because I think there is a certain
yes,
rationale that does
yes,
make sense,
that's a great
especially
word.
considering the structure of support they have the West. It looks very good in terms of PR, and it looks very good in terms of being able to gin up support. But this, in many ways, not in all ways, but in many ways, is no longer a conventional war.
Yes, yes, and we'll get into all the attacks that have been happening. Most of them thwarted. But in the next slide, you can see where Sujta is and what the Russians will are focusing on. Because, I mean, this town is a town of 6,000 people, I think, or 5,000, somewhere around there. Um, the Russians have, sorry, the Ukrainians have pushed a little bit in the next slide, which is north of Sujta. This blow up will show you today the Ukrainians pushed the Russians out of some forest belts near Nikolaevka. Um, yes, but that's all I have right now for the Kursk region. Next, we move to Velyka Novosilka, and this is an overall map. You can see that all those string of villages that the Russians lost in 2023, I think for except one, all of them have been retaken. So that salient that you see now, that's Velyka Novosilka. And in Slavic, that just means the great new, the place, the great new, the place of the many new or great villages, because there's 5 villages in Velyka Novosilka. Um, Yes, so you can see that they're expanding from the south and fattening up, if you will, their spearhead towards moving up to Velyka Novoselivka. The Ukrainians have not been able to push them out despite efforts in this area. And there's, of course, an area north of here. You can't see it on the map, where there's been a tiny gain. Uh, it's closer to Korachovo. If you want to go to it, Constantine, you can get to the blow up. This area is just immediately west of Rozdolny. Rozdolny was an area that went back and forth for a while in November, but now is under secure Russian control, just as Novi Kumar is the case. And where all of this fits in is an overall map of just where is Kurakovo in relation to the Novoselivka region. Well, you can see it in this map. Yes, that is the map, Constantine, just before we get to Toretsk. Yep, that's it. So there you go. The next town we're going to look at is Toretsk. Um, Russians have consolidated more gains here. As you can see by the red outlines, we can go to the blow up. These gains, I believe, are from yesterday. I haven't had any news from Toretsk as of today. The Russians in the southern part of this salient have taken some open fields and 4 trench networks. They've also taken over another earth mound, as you can see immediately to the right of it. And in the center of the city, you can see that they've moved several blocks in the center. And I'm sure right now that what they're going to do is they're going to go for that hill, that mound immediately adjacent to them by northwest. The next slide gives you a better idea of this central part that I'm talking about. Most of the buildings, yeah, that's the overall, that's it. Yeah, so most of the major complexes by the Russians have been captured. What's left now are just residential buildings and several earth mounds, at least 3 large earth mounds and 1 small earth mound. And then finally, a blow up of the area in the south that I was talking about, the earth mound that was captured, and the area to the west of that, which is the 3 trench networks. So that's it for Toretsk. And now here's we've already spoken about Chasiv Yar. This map will show you where they are in relation. So you can see that this is a very densely fortified area, and the Russians might want to make a pincer movement from Chasiv Yar south to link up with Toretsk. This would give them an amazing buffer zone if they did that, because immediately to the west of this area, if you see that outline with the arrow pointing down, immediately adjacent to that area, that grayed out area, that's Konstantinovka, and that's a big town. It is several times larger than Toretsk. So if anything, the Russians will want to secure these areas so that the Ukrainians cannot push down into like Avdiivka as a distraction. That might be something that they will try for if Pokrovsk looks like it's in trouble, right? Another thing is how invested are the Russians in this area? Obviously, they are invested, but how much? I'm not certain. I would suggest that they're more invested in this area than Terny, which is up in um, the Zherebets River area south of Kupyansk. Eventually, we'll get to Kupyansk. Actually, here we are. We're at Kupyansk. So these are maps from like 3 or 4 days ago. By the way, History Legend did a very good video last week or the week before about the fighting that has been happening in the Kupyansk
Yes.
direction, because the Russians have crossed over the Oskol River several times, and the Ukrainians have responded by pushing them out. But as you'll see with the maps I'm about to show you, the Russians nonetheless are still crossing over in different parts along this front, both south of Kupyansk and north of Kupyansk over the Oskol River. Uh, Obviously, what they're trying to do, if they're not doing it, what they're trying to do is get the Ukrainians to think that they're going to pincer Kupyansk from the west side of the Oskol River. Okay, so I don't know if you've shown the first slide or not, but that will give you an idea of where things are at the moment. This is where the gains that the Russians have made in the last week. The next slide gives you an idea of the gains that the Russians have made in pale yellow. That yellow outline way that's furthest up, that's Ukraine pushing the Russians out of a forested area where they had crossed over the Oskol River. But these other areas, the Russians are still there. I do have a better map that will demonstrate this. The next map gives you an idea where the Russians are in relation to Kupyansk. And as you can see, they're very close. They have 2 salients, a thicker one that is right out on the outskirts of Petropavlovsk, and the skinnier one, which is on the eastern side of Kupyansk. Of course, in the north, you can see that the Russians have taken over some forested areas. This is another area where they've crossed over the Oskol River, and they're going to hold on to that. They're going to want to go along this river and gain more territory now that they've captured that forest area. And we've dealt with this for months, that Sinkovka didn't fall for so long because the Russians never captured the forest area. But now that that's happened, you can see that they have a very sort of sturdy position. The next slide will show you the towns that I'm talking about in the area where the Ukrainians managed to push the Russians out. This was about a week or 2 ago, but the gains by the Russians are from today, which is the red outline. This is in the town of Rakovo, and it's near uh, Kirpichne and Dibrivka. So it's several villages in this area, but the town that they are currently in is Rakovo, and they're moving further north. And the next slide will show you what is happening in the south, the southern area where the Russians have moved to the Oskal River. You can see the gains that they've made there. You can see where the Ukrainians have pushed them out of a forest area north of Krukhanivka, and the areas where the Russians have gained south of Kruglayevka. So that's it for the map updates.
Well, I suppose that brings us into the next topic of discussion regarding Ukraine, and that is some of these more, as we had said earlier, unconventional attacks on Russia by Ukraine. And the main one that comes to mind, and then I do have a few speculations about a couple of other ones, but the main one that comes to mind is the drone attack on Kazan, where they were outright hitting residential buildings. There were the regular incursions and strikes into the border regions, Bryansk, Belgorod. Of course, the Kursk front continues. But Kazan in particular comes to mind, where there was a pretty large drone attack, which, like I said, wasn't even targeted towards military assets at that point, at least not seemingly so, and mostly did damage in residential areas. And on that same note, with drone attacks, I don't want to get into it quite yet, but uh, the plane crash in Kazakhstan that took off from Azerbaijan, it
Yes.
was routed to Grozny, which is in Chechnya, which of course is in Russia. And the two reasons that they were denied permission to land in Grozny was because of number one, fog. Number two, drone attacks. The recent drone attacks were also used as a reason to divert the flight. But you are seeing a ramp up ever since, especially the Kursk offensive, of these kind of attacks on Russia. And I think what a lot of people forget, maybe not our audience, but even people who keep up with the war, is that these incursions into Russia are nothing new. We're talking about all the way back to late 2022 when we first got the attacks on Bryansk and Belgorod, where you have these raiding parties that go over, where you have these strikes against these cities. And this is also on top of the airfield that was. I know, actually, I'll go back further. I think it was in early 2023, the Angles airfield, which is pretty far into Russia, I think actually near the Ural
Yeah, yeah.
Mountains, was hit. You've had several strikes in Crimea, which I know some might consider part of the front, part of disputed territory, but considering the fact that the Russians have pretty solidly controlled it for a decade, I don't think it necessarily meets that criteria. Say the same way that even the Donbass or Kherson or Zaporozhye do, but that's aside the point. But you've had these strikes once again all across Russia, particularly hitting the airfields, and really been airfields and residential areas have been the main vectors of attack by the Ukrainians. But the Kazan one, I didn't get a final casualty count on that, but from the footage I saw, at least, it looked pretty gruesome with just one of these drones flying just right into the side of an apartment building, and that was only one of many. Now, Russian air defense capabilities, have been largely successful at repelling these drone attacks. Of course, you can recall the ones that were actually launched against Moscow around the time of the Crocus attack. Actually, I think it was a little bit before, a little bit after.
Hmm.
So that was very strange events in coordination with one another. But of course, no system is going to be foolproof, and that you're going to have uh, things that slip through the cracks. But the Ukrainians are ramping up these attacks, and they're probably going to get more intense. And I know that a lot of this, I would say, more unconventional style of warfare started against the Black Sea Fleet. Now, there's some shills who will tell you that Ukraine has destroyed the Black Sea Fleet, which is just laughable. But once again, especially in coordination with the British, especially in coordination with the Royal Navy, the Ukrainians have at least hampered the Black Sea Fleet. Haven't disabled it, haven't put it out of commission, but they have actually made them engage in active combat in what is largely in land war because Ukraine doesn't have much of a navy to speak of, that they've been coordinating these attacks, particularly with the British. I mean, of course, with all the NATO countries, but particularly the British have been the ones who have been more or less waging the war at sea for them by, let's just say, more covert means. And once again, the rationale behind that is you're going to target the weakest link, and of the Russian military, I'm not saying it's weak in general, but I'm saying it is the weakest of the Russian military is the Navy, and I don't think that's controversial to say at all.
Hmm.
But I would only assume, and I'll get into Trump's so-called peace proposals and the uh, formula for peace. I'll get into that in just a minute because once again we're about 20 days, give or take, from inauguration day, so we'll get into that as we go on. But I do expect the Ukrainian attacks to become more unconventional. You could probably expect attacks near, say, Rostov, near a lot of the Black Sea coast in that part of Russia. And I wouldn't be surprised if you could probably speak to the climate better. If this war does stretch on into the spring and summer of next year, which is a real possibility, I'm really up in
Oh
the air.
yeah.
I'm really up in the air of when this war is going to end. I couldn't hazard a guess at this point. Much like they were doing in Crimea last summer, if they still have the capabilities, I think they're going to try to strike during tourist season because if their campaign going forward is going to be a campaign of terror, it only follows that they are going to target the coastal cities in the warmer times of the year when people really start to flock down there. And really, anywhere they can hit, I think they are going to hit. I expect more tensions to rise near where the border is with Sumy and Chernigov on both sides, really, because if the Russians are to open another front and not just continue on the current axis of attack, I do think it's going to be there because there's not really much else it could be unless they can convince the Belarusians to let them open the Kiev front again, which I simply don't see happening. But I do think that that border region right there is probably going to be the next flare up if the other fronts continue to go in the direction that they do, and who will initiate that, I'm not really sure. I can see the argument from both sides. The Russians want to open yet another vector of pressure. They've grown their armed forces to the point where they can sustain multiple fronts. But on the other hand, the Ukrainians also want to bog down the Russians. And you'll recall during the Kursk offensive, you did have these buildups initially, and that in my opinion, I still hold to it. One of the main reasons they did that was to delay that offensive, which they did see as inevitable. Because going into the end of July, beginning of August, I thought that was going to be the next move in the war, that the Russians were going to open a front in that northern sector, but that didn't quite pan out. And then also, I think one of the other big things that's still up in the air in terms of the war, in terms of, I guess you could say, new fronts, is uh, I don't think we've seen the end of action in Kharkiv, whether that be the city or the oblast. It's just looking at the map and looking at the context and the history surrounding all of it, it just seems too vital that it's just going to maintain status quo. And I know that you've had the slight incursions in there, and that you have had fighting along the border with that. But once again, if the war does continue on and continues to intensify, which I have every reason to believe it will, until really Kiev capitulates, because I don't really see them agreeing to any sort of peace agreement, even with the influence of the Trump administration. Like I said, I'll get into that in a few minutes. We'll cover that next. Uh, I don't see how uh, Kharkiv can be left out of it again because I know the Russians, they had their foothold there. They withdrew as part of the 2022 counteroffensive, but it just seems like a big question mark floating in the air as far as I'm concerned. And then there's the whole question of what's going to happen in the south, which has been, I wouldn't exactly call it stagnant, but it's been less active than the other fronts. And what's going to be done about Kherson City? Are Nikolaev and Odessa still on the table? You want to return to Putin and Medvedev's comments, what, about a week and a half, 2 weeks ago, about the possibility of annexation of more territories officially into Russia? So there's a lot of things that are up in the air right now, a lot of speculation that could be had. But I do think what we're going to see is the Russians are going to continue on, obviously, on the current axis of attack, and that I could see the Russians opening up a new front, and the Ukrainians, as that happens, as their situation becomes more and more desperate, their war effort will become more and more unconventional. And that's assuming they can still garner the support of the West, which I have every reason to believe that they can. And we will continue to see that more of a terror campaign from the Ukrainians than we've already seen before, with more attacks, I think, along the bordering regions and along the more densely populated areas, just to inflict casualties on the Russian population. Because at that point, looking at the Ukrainian rationale, which has some logic behind it, divorced from moral questions, is that really seems like the only chance is to really make the Russians, quote unquote, feel the effects of the war, in hopes of driving them to demoralization. But once again, as always, you always risk the opposite effect when Russia, especially having the capable armed forces to respond to that, it will only bolster the war effort, which I think, judging
Yeah.
by the previous attack, judging by everything we've seen in the past almost 3 years at this point, I don't see any way it doesn't bolster it. The more, let's just say, unconventional they get against the Russians.
Yeah, I mean, just to go back to the drones briefly, the drones have been more successful, but with much less damage than the attackums. There's already been articles now in Western publications, essentially saying that the Ukrainians are down to roughly 50 ATACMS missiles left, and that they had overused them. Well, I mean, you overused them in this case, could be relative, because they have to use a lot of them in order to oversaturate Russia's air defense system. And not that it hasn't been effective. Like there was an attack in a suburb outside of Belgorod. This is in the adjacent to the Kharkov region. Uh, Roughly like 5-6 days ago, if I remember correctly. Um, the reason the drones are more successful is the drones are made out of like material that's difficult for radar to pick up. They not only fly low, but they're difficult to detect because there's so few metal parts. Now, the thing is, all these drones, if you believe that they were shot off from an area, even like in Kharkov, but closer to the Russian border, where the fighting is taking place in Vovchansk, then they would have to travel at least 50 kilometers more than the limit. So my guess is that there are, just like, remember there were some attacks that happened in the St. Petersburg area. Dollars to donuts, it was some Finns or Estonians or Lithuanians or Latvians
Yes,
that
just judging by the
the
situation, there's no way it could not have been launched from either Finland or the
yes,
Baltic states.
yeah. So they're getting in on it as well, and they have been for months. So um now, because of course they feel it more than anybody else, that if America loses this, right, respect for America and its strength will diminish globally, and it will. Um, but it would mean that these countries might be the first casualties, not because Russia's going to invade them or that Russia can invade them, but it will drive their insecurity the most, right? And if the sanctions stay on, then these countries, and people talk about Russia's inflation being high. Well, I mean, all these countries have even higher inflation. So
Yes, and
it
historically, since the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia's inflation is quite moderate compared to what it was even just, say, a decade ago.
right, and their growth this year will be like 3.9%, which is actually quite good. Um, so I don't, people who are expecting like a Russian economic collapse, you're going to keep waiting. But
I'm just
in
thinking
any
of all
case,
those clickbait channels on YouTube that do the
yeah,
political analysis with the very sensational thumbnails about Russia collapses in 2023, Russia collapses in 2024, putting out the same video every year.
yeah,
They do it
yes.
with China too. That's another one they like. Strangely enough, they don't do it as much with the Iranians, and clearly the Iranians are the weakest link out of the
I know,
three.
like why not why not Iran? So anyways, um so we can see that the attackums are overall more deadly. I don't know if there was actually any casualties for the attack on that glass corporate looking building, or might have been some humongous condo in Kazan, very far away, as you mentioned. A 9/11 like attack. I saw photos from where the impact that happened. Um, I mean, obviously, this remote control plane that's smaller than a Cessna is not going to bring down the building, nor can it carry enough explosives to do something like that. It is just terror, and the reason that the Ukrainians are moving towards terror is because the conventional war is a failure. They're not able. I mean, the idea that they're going to go back to 1991 borders is ridiculous. It's something super extraordinary would have to happen for that to happen. It's not going to happen by conventional means, and that is why they believe that the terrorist attacks are what's important. And besides America, it's probably the British who are best helping them do the targeting and giving them advice. Remember, it was the British who said to attack the Belgorod region and the Kursk region because Russian citizens had to pay the price and so on and so on. Um, yeah, so that's what we're seeing. But the other bit of news this week that made headlines was at least four separate individuals were arrested for either sending photo documents or like I'm showing my age here, but documents over the internet to the SBU. One was just arrested today, but there were at least three or four, and I think four others who were also planning to do attacks on other military general staff personnel. So that's what they're going for, right? They want to completely demoralize the population. This is the way they're going to win, right? Putin
I
will eventually have to leave office, and the idea is basically that the Ukrainian breaking point is much further down than the Russian one. And if you keep doing the terrorist attacks, the Russians will break.
I do want to bring up one point on that matter regarding the assassination of the general that we discussed last episode. And that,
Kirillov.
yeah, Kirillov. And I do want to recommend a video I saw on it. And some of you, actually, a lot of you are probably familiar with him. I know you are. GDF, and he really cut his teeth. He had a few big videos that exposed the Israel lobby, that kind of content.
Yeah,
Great
he's
videos, by
great.
the way. He actually did one on the assassination of Kirillov and going over just the structure of the SBU and really just how embedded it is and how intertwined it is with the CIA. Now, a lot of you probably already know this stuff, but it even brought some points to my attention that I wasn't aware of. It's only like a 7 or 8 minute video, so I would definitely recommend watching that just to get an idea of really the size and scope of the SBU and what they're capable of. Because they are, especially as far as Ukraine is concerned, they are a very formidable intelligence agency. They are capable of doing these drastic things, and as we've seen, they've been doing this since the outbreak of the war. The SBU were in contact with that. What was it? That Russian Freedom Army or that Russian Liberation Force or whatever uh, drivel that was. Those guys who were what was it, like a half German, half Jewish guy who claimed to be a distant Russian
Oh
nationalist who
yeah,
went
yeah, the
into
RDK.
yeah,
Yes,
the
yeah, yeah.
RDK guys. That's what it is. Once again, they create so many of these fronts. It's really hard to keep track of which one is which. But then you also look at, say, the Crocus attacks, the attacks in Dagestan over the summer against the church and the mosque, where 9 times out of 10 these guys have some ties back to the SBU. And then there was the one recent case that was really trying to play the sensationalist media. Russia gives however many years to Quran burner. It turns out that was a minor charge compared to the fact that he was passing information to the SBU, which got no mention at all. Where,
Yeah, of
yes, they are a
course.
very embedded intelligence agency, and they do have a lot of reach into Russia, a lot more than, say, one would expect. And I mean, given the fact that the SBU and then the FSB, GRU, the Russian intelligence agencies, they all are successor organizations of the Soviet intelligence agency, KGB in particular, in some way, shape, or form. These organizations are still going to be very intertwined with one another because they all inherited the same infrastructure. Same with the Belarusian intelligence, which is also still called the KGB. So there probably is, and especially considering the fact that Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, up until the Maidan, were all on relatively good terms with each other. There was probably a lot of intelligence cooperation, and even though relations soured, it's hard to break those links, especially with something as deeply embedded as the intelligence agencies. So they probably all have a lot of connections with it in each other, which is, you look at post Maidan, especially in the military and in the intelligence agencies, why the Ukrainians were so extensive about their purges. Now, I know, especially in the military, the Russians have done their own purges, but it's been nowhere near what the Ukrainians have done since the Maidan, where any hint of
Yep.
Russian loyalty is snuffed out. You're out of a job,
Remember when
you're
the
in
war
prison.
started? Remember when the war started? I mentioned that over 1 million teachers, police chiefs, policemen, uh, deans of various faculties were dismissed right away and replaced with like loyal Ukrainians.
Yes, and that's been happening time again, but especially since the outbreak of the war, especially since the Russians got involved directly in February of 2022, that has happened, as you said, on that massive scale from the most minor of civil servants to the highest ranking. And they drove Medvedchuk, who was viewed as Russia's greatest ally within Ukrainian politics, out of the country within short order. And they've since snuffed out any sort of Russian sympathies in Ukraine. Now, on the other hand, you have people who put on the census that they are ethnic Ukrainians in Russian who still to some degree speak Ukrainian, or maybe more Suzhik in that case, but distinct without a difference as far as the politics are concerned, I suppose. And I mean, yes, while the Russians are trying to run something, I guess, of what you could call an empire, where they are going to have to manage these smaller groups, you can see where, in many cases, it has led to some pretty wide open gaps on their part. In which case, once again, you have to consider how much of a purist do you want to be, how much do you want to potentially alienate all these people that you have to keep in coalition with one another. But on the other hand, yes, it does leave some of these massive security breaches open. And that's something I think the Russians are going to have to learn how to deal with on a level that, once again, plays into the politics of a great power that has to keep not only internal peoples in coalition but external peoples as well, say China, India, etc., where they have a much more delicate balancing act versus the Ukrainians who can just do outright purges that are reminiscent of, say, Stalin.
Right. There is one silver lining. Um, Now there was a gentleman in Kamchatka, or he might have been in Vladivostok, who was contacted by the SBU to give, essentially spy and maybe blow up some military facilities in these regions. And anyways, he was promised something like I don't know, like 1 million hryvnia or rubles or whatever, and he said no. I want 50,000. This is from Missiles and Nukes, by the way. The Telegram channel, hilarious channel. Anyways, so he was he took the 50,000 and didn't do anything. In fact, he spent it on liquor, and they didn't want to lose him, so they offered him another 50,000 or 35,000. He spent that, and he never got back to them. So, anyways, I thought that was
That
hilarious.
these are the quality of people that get recruited in these kind of things, and
Yeah, 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 absolutely.
and as time goes on, I think especially with, say, the jihadists feeling more emboldened against everyone but Israel for some reason, whether that's in Syria, whether it's in Iraq, not only towards Russia, but even, say, into Iran, that you are going to get more of these kind of guys, more of these, I can't think of any other term, these rug brained guys who take 50,000 rubles or whatever the local equivalent is, bloat on booze, and then go commit their quote unquote martyrdom for the cause, or for Islam, or for whatever they put it on. And not only Central Asian Muslims, even though I think they're going to be a large contingent of that, you are going to get a lot of very, let's just cut to the chase, very stupid people who are bribed for very minuscule amounts to do these things, who, for whatever reason, for whatever security breaches might exist, have access to, say, vital infrastructure or vital personnel. And I do think this is going to continue. And when we get into the Middle East, I'll talk about some of the more recent assassinations that happened in Iran as well, because those are continuing. I don't think it stopped with Hani. I don't think it stopped with any of these other people from Iran or from the Palestinian movement who have been assassinated. The Mossad has been emboldened as ever when it comes to those kind of operations. So, and trust me, we'll get into that. But this kind of assassination warfare, I guess you could call it, can continue, and it will continue. And One
Yeah.
thing I'm surprised we haven't seen more of, especially in the wake of Nord Stream 2, perhaps Nord Stream was just too big of an operation that just blew the lid off everything. I'm surprised we haven't seen more substantial infrastructure sabotage. Because on one hand, it proved to really make its mark. I mean, and the Russians haven't been set back by it. In fact, the Germans have been the ones who have suffered the most. The Germans and the Europeans, for that matter. Um, but on the other hand, once again, it was such a monumental event. No matter who you're going to point the finger at, no matter what cause you're going to attribute to it, that I don't think you're going to be able to do that, because I know it was just a few weeks after Nord Stream, the Hungarians arrested somebody that they suspected was trying to sabotage Turk Stream, and it was either Turk Stream or South Stream, one of the pipelines that come up through there. I think it was Turk Stream,
Yeah.
but
There's Turk Stream and Blue Stream.
yes, that's what I'm thinking of. But I do think, especially as it continues, and to call back to our episode with George McMillan, as these pipeline wars are going to become a lot more intense in the next few years. Interesting enough, I would recommend on that note. I think it was back in the 90s, Pat Buchanan wrote a piece about how the next war in Europe will be fought over pipelines that I would certainly recommend to everyone who wants a deeper insight on the topic as well. And with that being said, I do think, especially in the Middle East, and less so in Europe, but still certainly in Europe. And yeah, I'll get the map up on the screen that you had sent me regarding the pipelines in Europe. But with that being said, I do think that these infrastructure sabotage attacks, when they get the chance, they will be more substantial and they will be more frequent. But I think it's just a matter of being able to get the element of surprise, being able to actually infiltrate into whatever country it might be or whoever it might be to sabotage that. But on the note of energy, um,
Well, I
yeah,
give you
go.
this map
Yeah,
because
I'll go ahead and get this up here.
the reason I sent it to you is January 1st, I believe it's 7 a.m.
Yeah,
is
7
when
a.m.
yes, is when the contract between Russia and Ukraine for oil transit stops. And Zelensky is saying, that's it, no more oil or gas. Of course, it'll affect countries like Slovakia, possibly Hungary, and Poland, maybe like several others are going to be affected because we've shown these maps before. The Druzhba pipeline is just but one of them. And anyways, so that's going to affect Europe, obviously, right? Fico said that if he turns it off, no more electricity for Ukraine. So what the Americans have done is they're shipping their LNG, which is 3 to 4 times the price that anybody else pays for, to Greece. And this map shows you the direction it will go in order to fuel Ukraine. So many, many more billions of dollars will have to be spent to do this. Now, it will help America to some degree, but it will not help Europe.
No, no, it
And
well, not at all.
ultimately, America will have to fund. Ukraine is not capable of paying for this gas, obviously, right? So America, in the end, will still have to foot the bill.
Yes,
How much that cuts into the profit, I don't know, but it will.
absolutely. And the question of, say, the Europeans also, and I'm sure this is probably something Trump's going to hammer on, where the French, the Germans, whoever, are going to have to help pay for it. Well, take a look at their economies. They're broke. That's simply not going to happen. And this is certainly using gas as more of a geopolitical tool than an economic tool. And that's it.
Yes.
It's just, and that is going to happen. It is such a vital resource. I mean, we see it on the Russian side as well. But the Russians, at the end of the day, it still is a net profit for them, even when they do play politics with their energy sources. And returning to what you were saying about Slovakia and Hungary and the current dispute between Fico and Zelensky, you did read
Which is really blown up.
yes, you did read the dispute, the statements between the two when the dispute first broke out about Zelensky with the effectively $500 million U.S. bribe is would have been the equivalent amount.
Yes, he
Uh,
was furious about
but
that.
the but the threatening to cut off electricity to Ukraine once again. We saw this play out in September once again, and the Ukrainians relented eventually, and they allowed the gas contract to be put through to completion. But we're in a whole new ballpark now because the gas contract is expired, and realistically, once again, I know that there are other ways, and that they might have to pay 3 to 4 times that the cost for energy for the Americans to pipe it in to really just the Balkans into Eastern Europe, the map that you're looking at right now. But this could be what tips the scales in terms of, I say, especially Hungary, because I know that they've been trying to foment a color revolution there for a number of years, and this could
Yeah.
be the economic crisis that they need to delegitimize Orban. And I think that
Yeah.
is very much a secondary goal in all of this. Of course, the primary goal is to cut the
Keep
Europeans off
Ukraine
from,
afloat.
yes, keep Ukraine afloat by cutting the Russians and the Europeans off from each other once again. And I don't know, perhaps I'm overlooking this. I know that you do have Turk Stream, you do have Blue Stream, you do have the routes to the south that the Russians do have. You also do have the oil smuggling operations where they will trade oil in international waters and ship it in to either Greek, Bulgarian, Romanian ports via a third party where it's not officially the Russians, which once again, there's still a higher cost on that because of the unofficial means. Or this is more so the oil than the gas, but buying it from a third party, say India, Saudi Arabia, China, etc. Even Egypt got on that grift for a while. Or there's the probably most expensive option, which is buy the American LNG that is much harder to transport and nuke your own economies even further. But with all that being said, I think really the only way this situation is going to get resolved in any sort of sane sense is that the gas pipelines are going to have to be part of a peace deal. If the Russians do fight this war, either to capitulation from Kiev, or if they, I don't know, agree to Trump's harebrained peace plan, there's going to have to be specific provisions about energy supplies to Europe. And something that Trump hammered on even about his first term was about Europe's quote unquote reliance on Russian energy and criticizing the Germans for the Nord Stream pipeline. You'll
Yeah,
recall
yeah.
that he actually threatened and used sanctions to some degrees in order to prevent the opening of Nord Stream 2, in which case we didn't see that happen until 2021, until actually Biden came into office, and for whatever reason relented on that or saw it just as not possible, or maybe they already had the plans to blow it up anyway, so might as well
Oh,
let
I'm
it go
sure they
through.
did.
So might as well do that. And once again, we called that back in 2021 when Nord Stream opened up. That
You did, yeah, in
yeah, that
November.
it's very possible they're going to blow this thing up. And 11 months later, they blew it up. I don't
Yeah.
I don't like that I'm right about these kind of things, but we do have a strange track record on that if we're going to
Yeah.
brag a little. But once again, assuming that this war ends in some kind of brokered peace and the Kiev regime doesn't completely cave in on itself, which who knows what the outcome at that point is going to be. Uh, I think one of the biggest points of contention, say after the questions of territorial exchange and NATO, number three, which I think is very much linked to the other two, is going to be Russia's role in providing energy to Europe. And the question is, what are Trump and his people going to say about that? Because you look at his foreign policy team already. We have Rubio, who is a neocon, but more so a Middle East and East Asian neocon. But once again, he still toes the party line on Russia, as they all do, but seems less concerned about it. Mike Wallace, who's like, we gotta be tough on Putin so we can force him to negotiate. Kellogg, who is his special envoy for Ukraine, who takes much the same line. Seems like Trump is appointing, particularly for Ukraine, a team that is, oh, if we just puff up our chests enough, the Russians will come to the bargaining table. It seems to be the rationale behind Trump's entire proposal for peace in Ukraine. In which case, I think we've seen that simply doesn't work. The Russians aren't going to be deterred by that. If that were the case, this war would have never happened in the first place had they feared that kind of I guess the conservatives would call it peace through strength that method, then we wouldn't be in this mess in the first place. But nevertheless, we are, because even when you do the tough guy act and say, oh, if you intervene, we're going to blow the tops off the Kremlin, which, for record, I don't believe Trump actually said that. That didn't happen, but you get the point. But at a certain point, especially with Ukraine, with the question of NATO membership, and with the question of having hostile troops that close to its border, at a certain point you have no choice but to act. At a certain point, it's either you go in, you make the first move, and hopefully gain the advantage from that, or you wait until this crisis blows up to the point where you have no choice but to intervene. And that was the situation Russia
Hmm.
was left in Ukraine. And I guess, although some would disagree, they chose the former. They did make the first move, even though some would say they made that first move far too late. You can have that conversation another time. I'm not going to get into that right now. But at the end of the day, what has ultimately become an existential war for Russia, in many ways, in Russia's global relevance, I suppose, at the very least, assuming that the people who want to balkanize Russia are just blowing hot air and they're not serious about it. At the very least, it's a fight for Russia's global relevance. That if Ukraine is that close to NATO, if Ukraine is that close to the Western powers, then Russia's global relevance is just going to bottom out. Once again, there's some things that are just simply not going to be negotiables for Russia, and unlike Ukraine, they actually have the power and the autonomy to back up their non-negotiables.
Yeah, I don't mean to divert, but
No,
just
please do.
to zoom back into uh, two events that are a confluence or a flashpoint, if you will, based on the subjects that were you brought up, and that is, the terrorism and uh, nullifying Russia's exports of oil. So the first one, the most recent one, we'll get into the other one, is another cable, telecommunications cable in the Baltic Sea has been severed. Remember that about a year or two ago there was a Chinese one, then there was another one, again blamed on the Chinese, right? And then this third time, it's been blamed on a Russian tanker, and the tanker has been seized by Finland, right? And they're claiming that it was. Now, I personally think the Russians have nothing to gain by this. I don't think they're involved, to put it mildly. Um, the West needs a casus belli to keep the escalation going, particularly for those people in Europe and in Finland in particular that are close to Biden. That is what they would want. It could also be that there was a lot of non-action, not many consequences for China, who they uh, presumed was responsible for the other telecommunication cables being damaged. So this is an easier prey, if you will. And then the other horrible thing that happened was a Russian tanker in the Mediterranean was blown up. 3 bombs had been put in place. I have no doubt that MI6 or CIA helped the Ukrainians do this. And Norway is denying this, but there was a Norwegian boat close by that refused to take the survivors. Now, fortunately, only 2 are presumed dead. The rest of the crew of 38 are alive. I forget who it was that came to the rescue, but this is an incredible breach. And the Americans have been talking about the ghost ships, Russia's ghost fleet. There's no ghost fleet. These are just literally ships that don't believe they should get insurance for their ships from Britain. Okay, other countries can supply insurance. They're not ghost ships, but it's good for Western normie consumption. So again, 2 remarkable events that are not good for Russia. Uh, they're not going to flip Russia, obviously. And the latest installment of sanctions, I believe this is the 17th, if not the 16th, is to go after the ghost ships, and I think that's what this is really about. What they're trying to do is also intimidate Russian partners like India and China, who are the biggest buyers of their gas. Of course, India is largely responsible for the most amount of reselling of Russian gas and oil. Now, what will probably happen is prices for gas and oil will go up globally as a result, but the Russians will find a way around this because those ships can be bought and sold to other entities that can eschew the sanctions. Oil and gas are just too big of commodities, and they will flout. They will um, put their nose up, as it were, to these American demands, most likely. It'll probably take a few weeks or maybe in a couple of months, but I do suspect that's what will happen because that is what happened last time. The rest of the world is not going to die on a sword or economically put themselves in ruination just because America wants it.
Yeah, I can't really add anything more to that than what you had said. I think that covers it pretty concisely. But I suppose with all that being said, we should move on to the so-called peace proposals for Ukraine.
Yeah.
And it looks like Trump has conceded that no, we are not going to have an end to the war before he even assumes office.
Remember
But
that.
yeah, I do remember that.
It's been an incredible week of surprises for Blumpf. He's I mean, there's still going to be a total Aryan victory with Vivek at the helm. It's gonna be awesome. He
I can't wait to really tear into that in the New Year show. That's going to be an interesting topic.
Yeah.
But no, I'm going to save that joke for the New Year show.
Yes, yes.
I can't spend my ammo now, figurative ammo for any feds listening, of course. But
Yeah.
yeah, you got to be careful with your choice of words. They'll nix you for anything these days. But but with that being said, not to get too far off course, is that the Russians have given some sort of conciliatory response to the idea of negotiations. However, they're insistent that a ceasefire will not take place. And the standard comparison that's being made, which I personally do agree with, is that it's going to be much like the Vietnam peace process, where it's going to be active war, that the fighting is still going to be ongoing, but there is going to be a more comprehensive framework for peace versus, say, what we've seen in the past 3 years, where Zelensky gets a bunch of countries together and a bunch of other leaders together and begs for money, which is what every other so-called peace summit has been so far. Um, but I think just out of the sake of pragmatism, that the Russians are going to be more involved in the next, I guess you could say, peace summit, if there is going to be one, where you will have these ongoing deadlocked negotiations while Russian successes do continue on the battlefield. And as this does continue, the Ukrainians are going to get more and more desperate, and alluding back to what we were saying earlier, they are going to continue these more and more drastic attacks against particularly Russian civilian populations. And with that being said, I know that Trump's threat so far, which I don't think he'll live up to, is that if Ukraine or Russia is unconciliatory, he's just going to cut off whatever side and really, uh, I guess you could say, give quote unquote free rein to the other. Where he said, "Oh well, if the Russians don't come to the bargaining table, then we're going to supply Ukraine more than anyone has ever supplied Ukraine before," which we know is not going to happen just logistically. But he's also said, oh, if Ukraine doesn't agree to some sort of peace process where they actually sit down at the bargaining table, we're going to cut off aid, which once again is not going to happen. But even beyond Trump's, let's just say, more buffoonish tendencies, it is in character with him to make the really high stakes offer at first and work his way down. Typical business negotiation stuff. Once again, stuff he's talked about a million times over in his own words. You can take that for what it is, love it or hate it. But that is the way the man operates. You can think it will be successful or not. I certainly have my thoughts on that, but that is just what we're looking at right now. He's coming in with his quote unquote highest offer and working his way down. But ultimately, what I think is going to happen is I do think that simply because the situation warrants it, simply because the situation has turned so drastically against Ukraine, there is going to be something of a multilateral peace summit that does involve the Russians in a real capacity where the Russians can actually state their interests. And that it will be the kind of deadlock negotiations we saw during the Vietnam War, during that comparison. However, they're going to realize, and I think that the Russians are just doing it out of the sake of formality, just to show that they are "quote unquote" dedicated to the peace process, that they're willing to talk this out, that they're doing it for optics reasons, in short. But what we're going to find out quickly during the negotiations, especially looking at the direction of the front line, I would say if Kursk falls before Inauguration Day, this is very much going to be the case. And I'm not going to say that's going to happen for certain, but there's a possibility that could happen. That the Russians are going to him haul through these negotiations while winning the war in a substantial sense, at which point said negotiations are not going to um, really be necessary. And the only way I can see this even coming to a brokered settlement and not the capitulation of the Kiev government, which either way it's frankly going to involve the capitulation of the Kiev government, is that one way or another Zelensky has to go. And I do think they are priming the pump for that. Now, who that replacement will be, whether it's going to be Zelensky, whether it's going to be Klitschko, whether it's going to be any of these other people, I don't know, or maybe it's some unknown like Zelensky, like Poroshenko was, somebody they're just going to dig up. I don't know. Maybe they'll break Kolomoisky out of prison, let him have his turn in office. I hope not. That would be disastrous, but even more disastrous than Poroshenko and Zelensky. Funny enough, Poroshenko, not to get too derailed, is already saying, "Oh, we need to sit down and we need to broker a peace process." Now that his little project has failed, he's one of the first voices to come out now that Trump has made it okay to talk about a peace settlement in Ukraine. But like I said, ultimately, I think this is just going to be a giant formality. While, in barring some black swan event, Russia more or less drives the Kiev government to collapse, which is the way I do see this war ending. I don't know how long that'll take. I could see this going on through the end of 2025, beginning of 2026. But I think this winter is going to be a big determining factor. How does Ukraine bear this winter? And will the Russians take the drastic move of destroying the power grid before winter or during winter? And unleashing waves of Ukrainian refugees and migrants onto continental Europe, because that also, I would say, that's Russia's shoe-in, but it would come at a great reputational cost, both inside and outside of Ukraine, regarding, say, their allies, the people who are more neutral towards their approach in this war. Think, I don't know, maybe some of the Gulf states, maybe even India at that point, some of the African countries. Once again, these countries that they've spent the past several years courting. I do think a move like that, being that drastic, would actually turn a lot of them off from the Russians, and that could be what really breaks that relationship. And I'm not saying they would necessarily be pro-Western, but they would be more amenable to the West after that point. The Russians did take such a drastic move, which is why I don't think, barring any dramatic circumstances, that will happen. But even if the Russians don't touch the power grid, this winter could very much be a disaster for Ukraine with how weak their infrastructure is right now. In which case, like I said, I think this winter, just depending on the forces of nature, is going to be the real determinant on how quickly this war is going to be ended.
Yeah, and this winter has proven to be a lot colder than the previous winter. Even the tail end of 2022, when the SMO began, we haven't seen any video footage of the big sea of mud that is Putitsa in Ukraine. Um, and fighting is still very active. A lot of the regions, as I mentioned in the last show, are snow covered. And although this week didn't have the same amount of strikes on energy systems within Ukraine, they nonetheless did. Another one in Dnipropetrovsk was hit. So, and you can see, um, there are more Western press releases about how difficult this winter has been for Ukrainians in terms of trying to find ways to stay warm. Of course, the recruitment, the TCC is now employing all kinds of measures. They're combing through streets in Lvov. This is far western Ukraine. These are the people who were probably some of the first to leave Ukraine. These are also the most patriotic Ukrainians,
And
and
all
the
the ones willing
ones,
to fight volunteered and got massacred in Krinky in early 2022.
yeah, pretty much. And they basically, a lot of them believe that they shouldn't have to fight to get the kind of Ukraine that they want. And you might, our listeners might not believe us, but if you look at where the recruitment has happened, it is central and eastern Ukraine. It is not western Ukraine, although now it is. Um, of course, there's scores and scores of these videos where men are snatched off the street, and they're debating again. I think they've accepted that even if the Rada was incapable of passing the motion a week or two ago, they are determined that the draft age should be either 18 years of age or 20 years of age instead of 25. It already went down from 27 to 25. I guess that's the way Ukraine is going to go. Now, um, yeah. So energy is a bigger deal, and really, Trump is going to be at loggerheads with Putin. there's really nothing that the states can offer um, Russia without without Trump looking like he completely bent himself out of shape for Putin because he's a Putin puppet and so on and so on. I think Trump, the reason he goes on and says Russia, 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 it's often at times where it's inappropriate for him to do so because it's not really tangential to the subject matter that he's truthing about. Because of course he doesn't tweet anything; he's still on Truth Social. Um, the it does affect him. I mean, he does have an ego. I mean, we all do, but his is a little larger. And really, I mean, a lot of people have said this before that America might be at an impasse with this war. And I've said it many times that, you know, they did not ramp up the amount of munition factories that they were necessary to win this war. There's still endless talk about sending NATO troops to Ukraine, blah, blah, blah. Um, None of that seems to have manifested. We'll never know whether it will or won't until the day that it happens. But so far, it's been just talk for nearly a year or more. Um, so what's left? I mean, what will be the reputational hit that America will take if they lose in Ukraine? Because Europeans, I mean, they don't care for the Ukrainians, right? Like, there's already efforts now to send them back, and they're sending them back ostensibly to cities that don't even have proper heating anymore or water. Um, it's threadbare. Um, so, I've often thought, like, will they use some tactical nuke? Do they have some kind of a special weapon, the Americans, that is, that they'll use to try to intimidate Russia? Will they up the ante in terrorist attacks to the point where the Russians will be intimidated? I can't see that happening. It would have to be something much more drastic than more terrorist attacks, because America's been funding terrorist attacks in Russia for decades. I mean, America works very closely with jihadists. It knows, like, I mean, what the extraordinary thing about America, of course, is how, like, it's able to radicalize people that it knows will eventually hurt it as well, but it will absorb the hit, right? 9/11 is a good example. Um, but it hasn't given up on this strategy. It needs them as mercenaries, so it will embolden HTS and other Al Qaeda affiliates and even ISIS affiliates, but it will still bomb ISIS in Syria in some sectors, but not all. So it really knows how to manage this. And in many ways, there's less loose ends if America wants to sponsor terrorism in Russia. Um, because there is no, the Chechens, except if the Boston bombing, whatever one might think about that.
Yeah, the diaspora dissidents are always going to be a thing, but the Chechens have been mostly pacified and loyal to the Russian government.
Yeah, yeah. And so I would say that that leaves only one kind of response. Remember that Putin said, "Oh, you get your best air defense systems, put them in Kiev, and let's see if they can intercept, the Oreshniks or some of the other missiles that you may or may not know about that will send your way." Now, the Western press said nothing about that, but clearly Putin is challenging their reputation. He's challenging them to reveal how prepared or unprepared they are, right? And the thing I worry about is the West really, because obviously Trump is not any more in charge than Biden is. Like, I don't know. I mean, I hate to say it, but that is the case, right? I'm sure Trump has been given some kind of a narrative that, like, if you go along with this, this is how you'll be remembered. Um, we'll get into it when Geo is on the show, so I don't want to waste all that. But remember that Trump boasted about saving Al Qaeda. Now you'll say, wait a minute, GSP, when did he do that? Well, it was on NBC, not MSNBC, it was CBSN. It was he gave a press conference. Remember late 2019 when the Russians were
Yes.
ready to, yes, with the Syrians to take Idlib, and he wasn't going to cooperate. If he did this, they were going to bomb all these places in Syria, and yada yada yada, because Erdogan cried about jihadi babies dying and like all of that nonsense, right? And no, he boasted about that. He goes, should we let them kill millions of people to get rid of 35,000 jihadis? Right? That was his excuse. Like, I mean, he has a military that doesn't even pay attention to him. Like when he thought they were withdrawing from Syria, they were only increasing their numbers. So, like, he's not in charge. Um, like, you kind of have to accept that at this point.
And like I said, I'll save it for the end of the year episode when we get Geo on. But in many ways, I do think Trump has forged alliances that necessarily require him to compromise on some of his original positions.
Yeah, yeah. So what is going to happen, and what will, I hate to use the term because it's so overused now, but what will deep state do? I don't mean the deep state guys from Ukraine who've been forced to go to the front. I'm talking about the deep state in America. What will they do? Will they respect this? Or will they set something off? My guess is they'll set something off. They're not going to listen to him because he may sit on the throne, but the throne is not with him.
And it's not a unique take by any means. I've said it many times before. You've said it many times before. The only way in which I see Ukraine being wrapped up is if he puts the screws to Iran or has some great East Asian strategy that would justify cutting Ukraine off. That's the only way they're going to let it happen because with the way the global powers have aligned, they understand from the American Empire's perspective, from Washington's perspective, one of these three pillars has to fall. We don't care which one, but we have to take one out, so then it will cascade over into the other two. Whether that would actually work or not is another question, but that is the mindset in Washington right now. And with Ukraine, they thought they could topple Russia. Um, the Iranian question has been largely up in the air. They've been hesitant to touch China, and at this point, even looking at, say, what Trump statements and listening to what Trump has to say, it seems like he's trying to take a very conciliatory position towards China right now, especially with inviting Xi Jinping to the inauguration and talking about his great relationship with him. And although, of course, there's been the typical rhetoric that you'd expect, it does seem like that he is trying to sweeten the pot for the Chinese in order to have them to bring back Chimerica, really. Now, maybe not in the sense that it existed once before, where we export all of our manufacturing jobs to China, but he does want to seem to, at least in my read of the situation, want to achieve some détente with China, um, wrap up the Ukraine conflict, and then put the screws to Iran. Now, he will say, and
Mhm.
perhaps he believes it personally, that he doesn't want a war in the Middle East. But what he does want is he wants the Iranians to more or less accept all of his demands, which isn't going to happen. And of course, there's people in his ears who would have him initiate some sort of military conflict with the Iranians, despite whatever his personal views or personal instinct might be, which may be favorable to us. I don't think that he's going to go to outright war with Iran, but we are probably going to see escalation in the Middle East, judging by his foreign policy statements so far, where he wants a wrap in Ukraine, and he wants to play nice with the Chinese. He wants to be buddy buddy with Xi Jinping. Now, once
Yeah,
again, both of those could fall through, but as it stands right now, it looks like he wants to ease tensions with the other two to focus on the third one, which is subsequently the weakest link. And that also, interestingly enough, brings us to a situation where on January 17th through the 20th, Putin and Pezeshkian are going to be having a summit in which they are expected to sign strategic defense treaties. Now,
hmm,
how encompassing those treaties will be, we won't really know until we see what's signed. But Russian, Iranian, particularly military and defense ties, are going to be deepened, and I don't think it's any coincidence that they're going to do this on Inauguration Day either.
Right, right. I think yeah, that was intentional, absolutely. Um, yeah, I mean, I said it on the last show. Syria is not a bargaining chip for Ukraine. Syria is something else altogether. Iran is, right. They're going to want, because of course, if they take Iran, giving Ukraine to Russia, and mind you, Russia wouldn't even be able to control all of Ukraine or like Kiev or whatever. Like that's not going to happen. You know, it would mean that eventually in 10 years Russia would be so weak because of, let's say, in infiltration and compromise of Iran, and therefore Central Asia, right? Erdogan, of course, is very focused on changing the nature of Central Asia. He wants to use, the Turkic background, the ethnic Turkic background of in a kind of pan-Turkic movement. Apparently, many of these Turkic Central Asian nations are going to be switching to the Latin alphabet, just as the Turks did. And so I could see a deal between Turkey and America over Iran, right? That would facilitate for the Americans a stoppage of China's influence in Central Asia, because of course the number one thing that they want is to stop China's advancement into Europe. Now,
Yeah, they want to stop
Europe.
Belt and Road. They want to stop the land trade routes.
Right, they want to, yeah, because that is what makes them impervious to American pressure. Now, of course, in the end, what it did is it made Europe poor.
Which was a
And
sacrifice they were completely willing to make. Let's not get ourselves
Absolutely,
wrong.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. So, it's another example of uh, why the Americans,
Of
another
what,
example of how the Americans hate the Europeans. So,
or what Kissinger said: "To be America's friend is fatal."
yes, so then the next big project would be Central Asia, and um, toppling Iran, getting Iran in a civil war would be the ultimate prize, because it would secure American and Jewish interests in the Middle East, as well as American interests in Central Asia. Um,
And one other angle I want to add to the Iranian thing, if they do shift focus to toppling the Iranians, whether that be through direct military confrontation or through less direct means, which is probably going to be the latter than the former, judging by the situation the American Empire finds itself in, is that you can look at the Great Game between the Russian Empire and British Empire. You can look at the Cold War. Iran has been a southern flank of the Russian Empire. Now, the Russians never directly controlled Iran. There were times where they had uh, less direct influence and more direct influence over it, or I suppose it would have been Persia at the time, especially with its Central Asian holdings. But even Russia, with its entrenches in Central Asia, and I know that you had just gone over a very plausible scenario where via Turkey they tried to undermine both Russian and Chinese influence in Central Asia, that Iran nonetheless is still that southern flank of Russia, which is why I think that they are strengthening defense ties, and that why knocking it out in exchange for Ukraine is a worthwhile bargain. Because Syria, yes, Syria was very convenient to the Russians. It was very convenient for them to have those Mediterranean ports and that access, but it wasn't necessary, at least at this point, because it had served its purpose. Say immediately after the annexation of Crimea, in at the height of the Syrian civil war, Russia's Mediterranean access was a much more vital question. But now that they have their foothold in Libya, now they have their foothold further into Africa, Syria, I wouldn't say it became obsolete, but it became far less relevant than, say, what it was in the 2010s to Russia. But
yeah,
but with that being said, if they can knock out the Iranians, that opens up a southern front. Even assuming some quote unquote pro American government doesn't come to power in Iran and that it's just some, I guess you could say, quote unquote neutral government or a weakened state where nobody really controls the country, it still does give the Americans carte blanche to operate there, as it had in Syria, as it had in Iraq. When these countries are destabilized, they can get a foothold in there. And it's really two birds, one stone, because it satisfies the Israelis, their biggest rivals, taken care of. And you also have, once again, another front opening against the Russians where, while not directly bordering them, you only have Azerbaijan and a few of the Central Asian states that stand between Iran and Russia proper.
Yes. And this leaves the question about China. China is one of those. I mean, we've said it before that China is just. It's really like it has initiatives in some areas, and in other areas it does not. And um, like if it had more initiative with regards to Syria, things might have turned out differently. But it's not willing to stretch itself. Obviously, its some of its primary concerns are access to the Arctic and oil fields therein, even though it does not have any stake in the Arctic, any kind of contiguous border with the Arctic. Of course, energy supplies. But when you're talking about Central Asia and the Belt and Road Initiative that they want to establish there, right? Then they will have to show more initiative in this region, right? Now they have a sweetheart deal with Iran. Iran signed this enormous deal where basically they're beholden to China, essentially, right? That's who Iran is doing the most, but it's also what's keeping Iran afloat. Like what is the red line for China is the question, right? Because like a lot, some kind of proactive um, actions are going to have to take place, and knowing the enemy is also very important, and not developing some kind of cocoon weaved out of your own immediate self-interests. Take a look at Assad, even. Assad removed some Hezbollah and Iranian fighters that were stationed in and around Aleppo, right? Uh, and then, like a week later, the Aleppo is attacked, and a couple of days later after that, it falls. It falls to a force that's 1/10 the size. So it's not. Um, it it will be interesting to see what China does, because I'm telling you, Iran is crucial to Central Asia, and Iran falling will be that Kerasan or Herosan or Kurasan prophecy of the radical Sunni sects, and because of course there's been another flare up in Pakistan just a couple of days ago, where at least 15 Pakistani police officers were killed. So the Baluchis, which the Americans are also sponsoring, are uh, are responsible for this. Now, if Iran falls, I mean, like you're going to see kind of like what's happening in Syria, right? Where um, Christians and Shia are going to be targeted,
Yes, even
right?
in majority Shia Iran, they are. I mean,
Yeah.
they have organizations like MEC that they are deeply embedded with, who are this bizarre mix between this communist and Sunni ideology. Like it's very bizarre. They have their roots. They were actually initially allies of Saddam Hussein, who found themselves in the care of the United States after the Iraq War. I think a lot of countries, even in the West, designate them as terrorist organizations. But like I said, very bizarre.
America used to,
Yeah,
and then they took them off.
yeah, back when they were aligned with Saddam Hussein, of course. But that's it's funny how that works out. But returning to the point about Iran, I'm glad you brought up the prophecy of Khorasan, and that of course there's also the tidbit of news that the Taliban has quote unquote declared war on Pakistan as well. I doubt anything would really come of that. But getting back to a more relevant point with that is an overlooked element of this is that if Iran falls, if Iran is uh, effectively regime changed, China and to a lesser extent Russia's headway into the Gulf states is erased. Because you look at what China has done, particularly China has done, to bridge the gap between the Gulf states and Iran, seeing both as energy hubs for China, because of course they are. I mean, China is still mostly reliant on the Russians for their energy, but they had their other means they were extending into the Gulf states, into Iran. But if that falls through, the Gulf states are going to start taking account of the global situation and realizing if the Chinese and the Russians could not protect the Iranians, if they could not prop up their regime, if the West is that hell bent on destroying anyone who steps out of line, you're going to see the Gulf states start to fall more back in the Western camp again.
Yes, and the latest news. So Russia has sent 15 of its top level Su-35 fighters to Iran, and the rest, I don't know what the rest will mean, but the rest of them will should be there by March or April of 2025. Um, I think there's even some of these planes. There will be factories for Su-35s in Iran. So, yes, the defensive ties are going to increase. Again, I wait to see what China's initiative is because, like, I mean, obviously, I think China felt that it did a lot. Remember in 2023 when they got Iran and Saudi Arabia to reopen their embassies and sign peace agreements and all that? Well, I mean, I think that was very successful, and I think they felt that they had done their part. But I'm talking about more on the ground stuff. Overcoming sanctions or making the Americans pay in one area in order to alleviate the situation in Syria. That would have been helpful, but again, they don't. I just think they're too myopic.
I would agree. And I do think beyond the question of hard military power, and I think the Russians are making a wise move by deepening security ties with the Iranians by transferring military hardware to them, by even licensing out the rights to, say, the Su 35. The bigger question I think that needs addressed, and we did see this between Russia and China with their summit to prevent color revolutions, particularly in Central Asia, is what is going to be done to preserve Iran from internal collapse. Because right now, you have a confluence of events. You have an increase in economic pressures from the sanctions and from a number of other factors, but particularly the sanctions. You have desire for less stringent social controls, and this is beyond just even the obviously glow in the dark color revolution people, the women who get half naked and protest in the streets and then get beaten so it can be put on the front page in Western news. So to, I'm not talking about that, but I am talking about
Yeah, yeah.
people. I am talking about people who do live with this very particular legalistic form of Islam, who at a certain point start to see it as overbearing. Not and like, and there's plenty of reasonable people in Iran who are like that. It's just the problem is they do get mobilized in these kind of color revolutions, which end up destroying their country. So you have that factor. You have the factor of the Iranians getting some egg on their face with, say, all the assassinations that have been happening. One would think of Haniyeh in particular. The mysterious circumstances of Raizi's death. The seeming, I would say, I don't know the word for it, but I guess you could say, for lack of a better word, the meekness of the Ayatollahs at this point, where they are becoming very reserved, especially in their old age, where they are not taking as bold as action and what looks like really Israeli impunity to strike into Iran whenever they choose to. Now, would the Iranians have the capable air defense to strike back? I would say so, that they could probably knock out an Israeli jet that was going to launch a strike against them. But point being is, the Israelis now have two routes, whether through Jordan and Iraq or whether through Syria and Iraq, in which they could launch a strike at the Iranians they wanted to. But point being is, there's a confluence of both internal and external factors in Iran that make it very susceptible not only to a regime collapse, but just an internal quote unquote reform that kneecaps the country. And I know it's a cheap comparison, but I do think it holds some water. That Pezeshkian has touted himself as kind of a Gorbachev figure who's going to come in here and implement the quote unquote commoner sense reforms that very well could just collapse the nation at a certain point. And even beyond,
That's a great
yeah,
point.
even beyond just outright military pressures or economic pressures, if you have those combined with, say, just the amount of discontent in Iran, that could fall through. I think the main factor is economic, in which case sanctions relief is going to have to be the main thing. So whether Russia and China can sweeten the pot economically through trade deals, through even outright economic aid if they have to, or whether, I don't know, they could convince the West to have some sort of sanctions relief, which I understand is not going to happen. Uh, they're really going to be stuck in this problem until it boils over. In which case, I'm not saying that the Russians and the Chinese are obligated to just be the caretakers of the Iranians, but from their interests in this new great game, so to speak, I do think it would behoove them to invest more in the Iranian economy, and not that they don't invest a large amount already, but to really ensure that Iran sees some degree of economic stabilization, because this could create cascading effects that lose them a vital ally.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think this is. I don't think this situation can be underestimated. Um, it's very serious. The situation that will unfold with Iran eventually, right? Now, the West may decide to focus on some other areas. We should probably get into Syria because that might be an area of immediate concern,
Yes,
but
and
it's not so crucial to the
to the great game, so to speak.
to the great game. Not now, anyways.
But before we move on, one last point I wanted to make about that. In retrospect, although there were obviously immediately strategic and tactical reasons to do so, I think that the assassination of Soleimani is one of the worst things to happen to the Iranians, because yet he did have political ambitions. Many people speculated that he was going to run for president in 2021. In which case, I
Yeah,
think that he was the man that the Iranians needed, where he wasn't overly dedicated to, say, the more like legalistic form of Shia Islam. He was more of a nationalist, a civic nationalist at that, because Iran is very multi-ethnic. I mean, it does have a clear Persian majority, but there's a lot of other groups in there, as we all know. But he was,
it's comparable to the U.S. in that about 60% are Iranian Shia.
yes, but Soleimani was a very uniting figure. He could have been the strong man versus, say, the more religious cleric that had traditionally ruled the country. Even in the position of the presidency, you still had a lot of people from the more clerical background. And while I'm not a secularist by any means, even though I have my opinions in Islam that I'll withhold for now because they're not relevant, I do think something of a strongman, something of somebody from a military background, looking back in retrospect, looking at 2020, going to the future, is what the Iranians needed to answer their current challenges, and they did not get that.
Yeah, Blumph had to save Al Qaeda, so Soleimani had
poor,
to go.
poor Al
Good,
Qaeda.
good going, Blumph. Honestly, it's just, I'm sorry, it's just irredeemable.
It is sad.
Yeah, we lost 3,000 of our own people because of,
yeah,
but you
it's
got to think.
I don't even know what to say. And I mean, I suppose I don't want to dwell too much on the topic, because, like I said, we'll get into this at the end of the year. But I suppose best case scenario for Trump is we just get a repeat of his first term at this point, which, I mean, I would take.
Yeah,
I wouldn't be like overjoyed, but it would be okay. But like I said, I think he's made some fatal alliances that are just going to screw a lot of us over in the end, just on a grand scale. But as you were saying, let's get into Syria.
yep.
So, where do we even begin?
Well, why don't we begin with what's his name? NFC Peace. Remember that
Yes,
guy?
yes.
Okay, so some very, very interesting cooperation um, coming from an interview with a Syrian girl and what's his name? Patrick Henningsen of 21st Century News.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, so remember that I told you about uh, Mayor al-Assad or Maher al-Assad, the brother of Bashar al-Assad.
Commander of the 4th Division.
Yes, yes, there were several generals underneath him. There was the one general that was killed on the spot. Now, I sent you the clip and everything, or the screen cap where it was where she said that he had committed suicide. So this is kind of interesting. I don't know if that's the case, but there are cells right now that are remnants of the Syrian Arab army that are fighting. And apparently, I don't think it's Assad. It might be Maher al-Assad, but he's still fighting.
Yes, at least the Fourth Division. I don't know how directly involved in the fighting that he is because I know that he had retreated into Iraq and linked up with the PMF forces, but or PMF. But yes, the Fourth Division it has put up the most stiff resistance since the fall of the Assad government in Damascus, and it does make you wonder. I know a lot of people were speculating about how ragged the Syrian army was at that point, and they couldn't put up a fight. And judging by at least the initial performances of the Fourth Division in their actions against HTS and whatever other organizations they might be fighting against at this point, I think it does show that yes, there was deliberate sabotage on that part, and that Assad was effectively removed in a coup, and that there were traitors and snakes within his government who destroyed it. And I know that Maher has come out of hiding. I'm not sure of his exact location, but
Well,
I,
some
I'm
of Assad's family is being rounded up right now,
oh yeah,
and I've
that
seen video footage, both of former soldiers uh, of uh, of Syria that are being forced to go back into these green trucks. We remember we saw those columns of men leaving Syria for Iraq.
yes.
This is, I mean, this is some of the most blackpilling stuff I've ever seen. Um, it's horrible. It's right up there with the video footage of women who've been taken into slavery, whose husbands, both Alawite and Christian, have been killed. But please do tell me about how America is a Christian nation. Um, please, but I've been literally watching this stuff for over 30 years. Like, if you're one of these people, please get real with yourself. Um, so, um, so Maher is apparently giving up a fight. Lebanon has uh, given Syria 70 men that were fighting. All these men will be executed. They'll be lucky not to be tortured. That's how cruel this regime is that America sponsored, and that ultimately Trump helped save. That Qatar and Israel backed up. So it's not looking good. But the other bit of news that's very unusual, everybody's sort of been talking, or if they're not talking about it, they're thinking about it in the back of their heads, and that is Russia leaving Syria or not? And now Giuliani is saying that he wants Russia to stay. And as I said way back, like 2 weeks ago, that they're going to want them there for negotiating purposes, right? Because now, the terrorists are asking, like, okay, we did you guys a great favor. Can you do something for us? No, they're not. So apparently, the latest statement from the U.S. is there's not going to be any sanctions relief until 2029. So they're going to have to endure another 4 years of sanctions that the Assad had to. And my guess is, some sanctions might be reversed, but it will never be enough that this could ever be a peaceful and stable country, because it's not in America's or Israel's interest for it to be stable. So, I mean, it's very cruel. I don't know how else to put it. It's so depressing every time I think about this.
It's an outright disaster, and I really don't know what else to say. That this is going to once again have cascading effects, and I know that the Europeans right now are very much on the train of Syria's at peace. We can begin the remigration process, but that's simply not going to
Yeah,
happen. It's not
yeah,
going to
and
be
what it
allowed to
what
happen. More
yeah,
refugees will pour out from Syria, and where
yeah,
else are they going to go?
yes. So, I mean, the reason I said earlier that America is not a Christian nation, obviously, right? A Christian nation would not have the ability for sodomites to adopt children. It would not have gay marriage. Like, this is obvious. But I'm talking in this particular case, I'm talking about the Syrian Christians who, despite already being killed, went into the streets and protested, right? That's what I'm talking about. These people are martyrs. They are willing to die for the faith. something that sadly a lot of Western Christians will never know. It's bad to be arrested in England for praying in front of an abortion clinic, but it's nothing what these people are going through. It's not even on the same scale. Let's be honest. And these people have gone through it repeatedly. So anyhow, yeah, sorry, I didn't want to interject that way, but
No,
I felt like in
it's
retrospect that I needed to flesh that out a little bit.
yes, and I mean this is as I'd said before, it's only going to continue. It's only going to get worse, and I suppose some. I mean, I don't. In fact, I don't see a method of stabilization at this point, and I wouldn't be surprised, especially depending on Trump's position towards Turkey coming in, if the U.S. does cut the Kurds loose, if they feel that they've actually gained an ally in Turkey. Now, I'm not saying that's going to happen, but I do think at a certain point we actually might get America out of Syria, but under the worst circumstances possible, as it seems every American withdrawal is conducted under. But I mean, at this point, I suppose if the Fourth Division is still alive and still is fighting, uh, the Iranians could conceivably bolster them, or if the Iranians have assets, or if the PMF is willing to go into Syria itself. But as I said before, the even before the fall of Assad, when it looked like it was just a few days away, which it turned out to be less than 12 hours away by the time we had recorded and put it up, that the Syrian war will continue, that there will be a reignition of tensions that we have not seen since, I would say, at least 2018.
Yeah,
And
Kurds and HTS and a different faction, not HTS, which either was
is that
funded by the
the
CIA.
Syrian National Army?
Yes, the Syrian National Army. I forget whether it was the Pentagon or the CIA that funded them, but anyways, these were at one time the moderate beheaders, former Al Qaeda, former ISIS. So they're still fighting the Kurds, right? Erdogan is still threatening, I'm going to go in, I'm going to go in. Like you're already in he still hasn't figured out how to get rid of 3.5 million Sunni Arab refugees um, out of Turkey. Um, you know, the Americans might dangle the carrot that once we get rid of Iran, Central Asia will be all yours, and so just keep them. Just keep them. They'll go back later. Don't worry about that now. I wonder if that's been pitched to the Turks yet. It'll be very interesting to see what happens after Erdogan is gone, because I don't know how long Erdogan is for this world. You know, despite his setbacks, he still gets reelected, and I imagine a lot of Turks are feel vindicated. After 2023 with the earthquake, and he barely wins the election. I think a lot of them now feel very vindicated. Um, so the next election is still a ways off, several years from now. If he doesn't die, and he still has a pretty good track record. So even if he steps down and doesn't run again, you would expect it will be somebody that's more like him than Gulani, like you know some of the people that the West wants.
Yes, and I know Erdogan has floated the idea of a third term and amending the Turkish constitution in order to allow for that, but we're also talking about a man who constantly blows hot air. He says a lot of things that he simply will never follow through with. So who
Yeah.
knows the greater game behind that? I'm not even going to bother speculating, because once again, this man puts out so much just frankly garbage. It at a certain point you have to sift through to find what's actually valuable within his words. But in terms of, as you were saying, you're not going to get a pro-Western Turkish leader who is a good, obedient NATO statesman, which is what the West would want. Uh, because of Erdogan, he has maneuvered Turkey into a position with its international relations, not only with the West, but the Russians, the Chinese, the other Middle Eastern powers, etc., where they do have to play middleman. and Erdogan has been exceedingly successful at it. You can hate the man. I certainly have many things
Mm-hmm.
I could say about him. We'd be here all day, and probably some of these would get me banned using with some of the language I would want to use. But that being said, given Turkey's geography and given its relationship with its immediate neighbors and the global powers, at a certain point, it is forced to act in this manner, in which case, it's a country that has the luxury to do that because of those factors, but it is also, it doesn't make you many real friends, so to speak. It makes you a lot of alliances of convenience, which I suppose that is most of global politics, but that's especially true in Turkey's case, where they have no, say, long-standing ally that they can call upon, even in, let's just say, less favorable times. Uh, Turkey will only ever be viewed as a convenience, and Turkey will only ever view the other powers of the world and other regional powers as a convenience as well, which is a very dangerous position to be in, which makes it a very volatile nation. And it's really, I would say, the epicenter of disaster for a lot of what happens in the world, and I don't think there's really any way around that. And I suppose Israel's next friend turned enemy, we'll see if it's actually, I gave it away already, but Turkey's next friend turned enemy may be Israel, depending on how their
Mm-hmm.
interests collide in Syria. Will they come to a quote unquote understanding? Will Netanyahu make the sweetheart deal of, say, you can have east of the Euphrates. We don't care because we're trying to build Greater Israel, which that's our boundary. So you can take care. You can solve the Kurdish question, even though that would come at the cost of oil. So maybe the Israelis wouldn't be too keen. But I don't know. Maybe they'll make some sort of bizarre deal with the Turks where, and this is just me speculating. I don't think this is going to happen. Where Israel allows the Turks to move into eastern Syria so long as the oil shipments continue to some degree. And while they do have their very public rivalry, Israel and Turkey once again are still shaking hands behind the scenes. I'm not saying that's going to happen. I'm not saying that's even likely, but that is a possibility given what we know between Israeli and Turkish relations, where, especially in recent years, it is very contentious yet very cozy behind the scenes. And
Mm-hmm.
I do think, on that note, we should move on to the situation Israel might find itself in if you have no further thoughts on the Turkish question.
The only thing I'll say about Turkey and Israel is um, the moment. I mean, I think America's even more invested in the Kurds than the Israelis are, and that's mainly to keep check on Erdogan, right? Um,
Yes.
the Israelis have abandoned the Kurds several times, but the Kurds are just these people are just they're so resilient to constantly be betrayed, and they still will side with the West. They're ideal, actually. Um, you'll never find a better lackey than these people. But so I think that the moment that he starts to really challenge Israel is when we're going to see terrorist attacks in Ankara and in Istanbul. We've seen them before. I remember some of them targeted Israelis, right? Uh, Obviously, some of these people are expendable because ultimately the narrative shifts back to Israel as a victim, and some concessions are going to have to be given to them. So I wouldn't be surprised if something like that happened again. Um, but I would say the moment that he starts to really either anger the Americans or the Israelis or both, that is when we're going to see that. And like I say, it's and you've said it. It's a lot of hot air. He says he's going to fight the Kurds, but he hasn't really. Like, I mean, they're fighting. Yes, they're killing each other. Yes, I don't care for either side, um, but has he achieved his goals? Has he moved those refugees back? Where's he going to move them? He's going to have to remove Kurds, some of which took over areas where some of these people lived. To do that, is America going to let him do that? I mean, America would have to make Syria like a non-issue, which they could. Their media is absolutely capable of doing that. They can easily memory hold just about anything. Um, and of course, ultimately, can they memory hold Ukraine? But that's all I have to say about Syria at the moment.
Now, to move on to Israel, I do, and I'll probably address this further in our New Year show as we look at the year in retrospect. But I do think I had underestimated the Israelis. I do think I did not give them enough credit because I'll stand by my initial assessment from 2021 onwards that they were in a very precarious situation, that they were surrounded on all sides, barring, say, Egypt and Jordan, but that their northern flank was very much at risk, and that the so called axis of resistance did provide enough pressure to really keep Israel in check, if not slowly erode away at that. With Since October 7th, I know that we've seen uh, a drastic change in that, where although Hamas does continue to hold on to parts of the Gaza Strip, and that they still do continue to inflict significant casualties on the Israelis that should not be downplayed, uh, the war has stagnated, and that Palestinian
Hmm.
civilians have suffered immensely, and that's frankly an understatement. Hezbollah showed that it had major security breaches, with especially the pager attacks and the cell phone attacks. Syria showed that it was either a paper tiger, which I don't think is quite the proper assessment, or that there were enough subversives within the Syrian government that it was able to fold like a house of cards and give the Israelis carte blanche to move into parts of southern Syria. And the Iranians, especially with Pezeshkian power, have shown themselves to be a rather tepid country where they aren't willing to get directly involved, or their responses may be insufficient to many who observe the situation, or at least seem inefficient to many who observe the situation. And that, yes, the Israelis have bought themselves quite a bit of time, quite a bit of room, given the circumstances where I wouldn't say Hezbollah has been neutralized, but they have been, in many ways, the threat that they posed to Israel, excuse me, has been severely degraded. Syria, once again, has been plunged into the thick of civil war with no air defenses, no air force, no army to speak of, no government to speak of. Once again, Egypt and Jordan are completely pacified, and the Iranians, once again, are, let's just be frank, pussyfooting around the situation, and also have had their supply routes cut off. And with all that being said, like I said, the Israelis have bought themselves quite a bit of time and quite a bit of space, admittedly. But
Hmm.
and this, I'm trying not to let my personal biases affect my next statement, but I do think it's worth being said. We should consider what Israel looked like before October 7th, 2023. It was on the verge of what looked like at least massive civil unrest over Netanyahu's power grabs, particularly with
Hmm.
the
Hmm.
judiciary. And assuming this breathing room is what they wanted, and that their goals have been accomplished, where they aren't really under the siege, if they can wrap up the Gaza conflict somehow, as Trump would say, if they can, I don't know, finish off what's left of Hamas by brutal means, which I don't think is as simple as it sounds, or if, I don't know, they just cut their losses and agree to some sort of ramshackled peace treaty on the Gaza Strip, where, oh, we stay in these parts and we let Hamas run the rest of it, and we'll still launch our routine attacks. It's just not going to be outright conflict. Assuming some sort of agreement like that can be reached, and Israel has secured its buffer space. Once again, that question of Netanyahu, that question of all the internal political crises that were very much the center of Israeli political life before October 7th, 2023, come back to the forefront. And while they may have bought themselves that position, while Netanyahu may have won some goodwill by being able to secure that position, and once again, we also need to take into consideration the people who now have resentment towards Netanyahu because of the higher than they should have been, I'll say, Israeli casualties, particularly in Gaza. What is Israeli political life going to look like? Are they going to see a great internal stabilization, despite the fact that they have externally secured themselves at least temporarily? I think there's a real question that no, it will not. And then also, you still have the most robust members of the quote unquote axis of resistance coming out of Yemen, with the Houthis, Ansar Allah, whichever you prefer, and frankly, the Yemeni government at that point, who are still able to launch substantial strikes into parts of Israel. That question
Yes,
is still unresolved, and
and
that's
there have been more by Yemen.
yes,
Yeah, Yemen did a Christmas strike. It literally said "Merry Christmas" to all Christians and launched hypersonics into Israel.
Well, I suppose it was just a Wednesday for most of the Yemenis and Israelis, but you know. um, but with that being said, yes, I do recall that they did that. That was that this is 21st century warfare. what,
It
what
really is. It is.
what else can you say with that? But with that being said, even ignoring the Yemen question, which I think at this point is the giant elephant in the room, Israel still needs to overcome its internal political contradictions. Is
Mhm.
Netanyahu going to be allowed to stay in power? If not, is he going to be allowed to be a free man? If not, is he going to be allowed to flee the country and go live at Mar-a-Lago while Trump is in the White House?
Right, right.
Because once again, we all know that these people have golden parachutes. Once Zelensky gets knocked out of power, he has his golden parachute. None of these people ever face the consequences of what they've done and the destruction that they had wrought, and that shouldn't really surprise anyone. Now, should it? But it does beg the question. Although Israel has worked itself into, say, a much more comfortable position than it was in just 5 years ago, number one, is it going to be able to maintain that? Number two, when it comes to internal Israeli narratives, when it comes to their political narratives, their civilizational narratives, their religious narratives, how are those going to fare in a new state of, at least as far as Israel is internally concerned, relative peace?
Hmm. Hmm. Yes, I mean, all important questions. Netanyahu today had prostate cancer. Unfortunately, a potential prostate cancer operation.
And I did see the updates
I
that
regret to inform you he survived.
yes, you took the words right out of my mouth.
And so, I mean, you're right. It was all this turmoil, and then suddenly the war put the turmoil away. Um, I mean, in a way, it shows you just how irredeemable the Israeli public is. Um, there was an article that appeared. I don't think it was Haaretz. It might have been the Jerusalem Times. 130, 135 bodies that were discovered at the Nova, musical gathering that took place during the Hamas terrorist attacks on the 7th. 135 bodies were not from there. They were brought over from other regions and piled there. The thing is a lot of these bodies are charred. We don't even know who they are, right? And the military admitted that they had brought over these other bodies. So, like, the number was probably inflated. The idea that Netanyahu didn't know until 12 between 12:30 to 1 what was happening, what had started at 6:30 in the morning. Like, I don't buy any of that. A lot of even Alistair Crook doesn't buy this, right? It was a costless belly that they needed. And he survived. He politically survived. And I know we said on the show that but ultimately he went for Syria. Ultimately, Biden, who desperately wanted to be president again, of course, he made some statements today that he could have beaten Trump, no, Trump.
I believe it.
um,
Riding
yeah,
Biden.
whatever. I mean, I don't think so, but that's what he thought. Um, I said it even last year. Like, the reason Biden is easy on him is because he wants the Zionists to back him, so he defeats Trump the year after. So that's what 2023 and 2024 was about. Was the Democrats sort of behaving like the Republicans and funding Israel. But I mean, ultimately, however gruesome, and it was gruesome, it paid off for them.
Yeah, it did. And there's really not much more to say on that note. So, I suppose with all that being said, do you want to talk about Trump's continued efforts to consolidate North America?
Yeah.
So, we had touched on it briefly, and we will certainly touch on it more to come. Not only is Canada the prospective 51st state, which, once again, all joking aside, it does show very, I wouldn't say concerning, but very urgent look from the American state, speaking particularly through Trump at this point, in order to solidify power, particularly as the Arctic becomes more of a question and as the other global powers do rise, and as securing the home front, as it speaks, becomes more and more important. Of course, the question of Greenland has returned, which Trump had proposed buying from the Danish in his first term. And that has been the circus back and forth, what the media makes out of it. The Danes are acting all mighty and offended that Trump would even suggest that territory could be bought and sold. Very much the impotent European Atlanticist response, where when they don't personally like the U.S. president, they're going to take these very strong and resolute statements, but when it comes time for all the other nonsense like blowing up Nord Stream, they're all on board. The kind of
Right. If
leadership.
Biden made this, if Biden had said something, he wouldn't have said it the way Trump did.
Yes.
Okay, it would have been very different. But it would have they would have had negotiations, meetings, some kind of a partnership, an initial 10-year period of transition, blah blah blah. They would have gone. They would have used other methods if they thought that's what was best, right? And the Europeans would have gone with it. Like, remember when they resented Trump telling him you have to spend more? Then Biden comes in, it's like, oh yeah, yes sir, we'll spend more.
Of course, it's always that way. But with that, the question of Greenland, which I mean, the Americans already operate an airfield out of, so it would just be simple more consolidation of what we already have in Greenland if we were to acquire the territory. And once again, that plays into the Arctic question. It plays into the question of particularly missile defense. I know Trump has been very adamant about building a domestic missile defense system throughout his campaign, which I suppose in the abstract isn't the worst thing in the world, but does make you question some of the motives behind it. But I would say probably the biggest one to come out of all of this is Trump wants to put the Panama Canal back under direct American control. Now, for anyone who has paid attention to global politics for the past several decades or has looked in retrospect, has read any recent American history, even since the transfer of the canal back to Panama, the Americans have effectively controlled it. The American Navy runs the canal. That's
Yeah.
it's beyond any doubt. It's there's no question about it. The canal is still an American asset despite not being directly owned by the United States. And Trump and his people are now bringing up the issue that they want the canal to directly transfer back under American authority rather than the indirect American authority that's under right now. And I would imagine with that, now I know were some provisions in the transfer treaty that do allow for the Americans under some circumstances to reassert control of the canal. It's a bunch of legalese as one would expect.
Yeah.
But I do think with the question of the canal in particular, we do see that China does have certain footholds in Central and South America, and that
Including that new port
yes,
that
include
was open in was it Chile?
I believe so.
Yes. This is a huge, it's the biggest one on the western side of South America.
And with all that being said, I know that it was a proposal several years ago that the Chinese were going to build a Nicaraguan canal in order to compete for the international trade traffic and also to alleviate it. But I do think with that, and as far as Panama itself is concerned, to my understanding at least, it is one of those countries that is very much still within the American sphere despite everything, and that really
Yep.
is not that much of a home of Chinese influence. But I do think that they fear Chinese influence encroaching on parts of Central and South America, especially in Panama itself, to the point where they want complete control over the canal. They want to take it out of the Panamanian Authority and put it directly under U.S. control. And out of all of Trump's proposals of that sort, out of all of Trump's North American proposals, yes, I do think there's validity behind the Greenland one and the Canadian one, but I think
Yeah.
Panama is the most serious. And I think the Canadian one is obviously the least serious. You can judge by the way he talks about it. The 51st state, the governor of the great state of Canada, Trudeau. Once
Yeah.
again, that's Trump being Trump. And I do think, like I said, there are real intentions to further integration between the United States and Canada. But in terms of seriousness, in terms of proposals, I think the real ones are Panama in first place and Greenland in a distant second, particularly
Yep.
because of the question of sea trade, both involving the corridor between obviously the Atlantic and the Pacific and the Arctic, which I think also plays somewhat in the Canadian question as well. In which case, I think we can all agree that even if there's not further integration with Canada, the level of integration we have right now would pretty much give American carte blanche to access to Canadian Arctic access that the Americans wanted to encroach on that. We all know it would. But
Yeah.
in terms
I
of
mean, America would go
but
ahead.
in terms of Panama, like I said, I think that is the big one to focus on, and that if Trump is going to be the most belligerent about any of them, it will be the canal, and that he wants that back under American control because number one, the issues we had raised previously, particularly with Chinese involvement in Latin America, and number two, I think in terms of internal morale boosts for the American population, if you want to say a great American achievement, he could say, "Look, we controlled the canal again. Look, it's just like it was back in the good old days."
Yeah, I mean, if America was really serious about Canada and Greenland in the way it would be with Panama, and mind you, something like 67% of all ships that pass through the Panama Canal are American, anyways. That leaves like 33% or something that are all the other countries. So it's not like, I mean, I think what he's doing is he's making offers that are so extreme that another offer is really in the cards that is nothing like the offer that he's proposing. The other is, of course, he's campaigning to get Canadian conservatives on board to his side because I can tell you, listening to Canadian normies, conservative normies in Canada, like I mean, firsthand, speaking to them, especially guys who are a little older than me, they're like, "Oh, that would be great." Um, and I'm like, "Well, I mean, they already own Canada. Like, what more could they do?" I think that has to deal with the pipeline that Biden canceled. That's what I think the real wager is. If America was really serious about the Arctic regions, I'm not saying they're not, and it is something that they will become more serious about, given how the next 6 to 12 months go. They would be building, you know, an Arctic fleet of icebreakers.
Yeah, and keep in mind, our largest state has an Arctic coastline. We
Yes,
have Alaska still.
yes. The problem with Canada, of course, is that whole area around Frobisher Bay. Like, we have a lot of islands in the extreme north, and they're very hard to navigate. This is where a lot of sea wrecks and tragedies happened, particularly in the 19th century. America had a tragedy that happened in Greenland, very similar. Um, it might have been in the 1890s.
That sounds
I
about
can't
right.
remember. Yes, so I would say that they could build more of these icebreakers right now. Would Canada stop them? I mean, the Russians rescued some ship. I don't know whether it was Canadian or American, with one of their icebreakers some time back. So like, are they building them? I don't see them building them yet. So I think that the deals are about something else. Putting missiles there is more likely than building icebreakers.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the energy question because I completely forgot to bring it up this time. I did mention it last time where they do want consolidation over North American energy output. Canada has an immense amount of natural gas, a fair amount of oil. I think the U.S. still outproduces Canada in oil, if I recall correctly, but not in natural gas. In which case they can solidify that. And if we're looking at the European theater again, and to a lesser extent the East Asian theater, if we're going to turn LNG, turn natural gas into the bargaining chip that we want to treat it with to pull the map back up. If we want to bring this plan to fruition, it would be a lot easier if we had, let's just say, more unfettered access to the Canadian stockpiles, and because once again the Canadians have far larger reserves than we do, and while the Americans are still an energy giant, even when it comes to natural gas, we don't outproduce Canada. But if we could unite the two, I think at that point we would overtake, say, Russian production, Qatari production. I think we already outclassed the Qataris in production, but once again we'd overtake Russian production. That would put us on top. And even with the oil question, it would move us up a few ranks in terms of that. and it would give us a lot more bargaining power, a lot more leverage. I'm not saying that I'm not talking about a real integration between Canada and the United States, but if we can deepen the pre-existing economic integration, then it makes a scenario that you're looking at on this map right now a lot more plausible than it is currently. And it is still possible, but once again, it becomes an easier endeavor if you're able to get say the Canadians to participate in this adventure, so to speak.
Yeah.
Um, but with all that being said, I mean, in the abstract, you could think, like, as an American, as somebody who lives in the United States, that, oh yeah, that doesn't sound too bad. Us solidifying our home front and us having more weight to throw around, say, with Panama, with the Arctic, whatever. I mean, yeah, I can sympathize with that view, but given the current state of America, I said this last episode, and I'll say it again. I think it's in the best interest of, say, myself, you, the people listening to the show, is that both the United States and Canada, I think we would all be better off if we saw a decentralization of power, and that any political prospects, any of our goals that we would want to accomplish through, of course, legitimate means, uh, you would want a more federalized system. And while this might sound good on the surface, it might sound like, oh, America's really asserting itself, it's playing like a great power should, and not this bizarre sort of American empire that we've seen for the past 70, 80 years. I hate to break it to you, but that's not the case. It's just another facet of that. And it's just actually solidifying the assets in North America so we can continue the harebrained imperial projects in other parts of the world. And
Very much
like I
so.
said, and it actually appeals to a lot of, say, like the people who would chant America first at a Trump rally and who would be on board with that kind of stuff, and that we're not paying for the Europeans and we're asserting our own interests. That sounds all very nice. Where we are the top dog in our own neighborhood. But at the end of the day, you have to consider what is it going to serve, and it's going to serve. Once again, I will return to the map. Projects like this.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah.
But that's really all I had at this point on that. And like I said, especially when it comes to the question of American Canadian integration, some of the more let's just say absurd parts, I definitely want to save that for our New Year's episode because I can think of no better person to discuss a lot of this with than Geo. So
Yeah, oh, yeah. I'm looking forward to
yeah,
it. He's open to it. He's open to it. He's
perfect,
come.
perfect.
Yes. We just have to fix a date. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So I've been holding back a little this episode because I think we can't do a lot of stuff justice without that, and I also want to do more of a standard news episode before we do a proper year in review. But if you had any further remarks, I can hand it over to
Well, I'll
you.
just say this: if Gio doesn't respond soon, I'm personally going down to his town, and I'm going to blackpill him in a Tim Hortons if he doesn't snap out of this.
Oh no! Oh no! That's I've been to Canada a total of twice. I met you one of those times, and
Yes.
you know I'll say my initial impressions. I was only in Ontario, coming from Great Lakes region of the U.S. It's really not that different when you're in Southern Ontario.
No.
But I will say, just between the 2 years that I went, because I went 2022, 2023. The demographic change I noticed in just a year was remarkable, and
Phenomenal.
I stopped. I think actually at the same Tim Hortons twice, and I noticed just so much of a drastic difference. I'm talking
Yeah.
about for all the Canadians out there, you'll know the one I'm talking about. The one on the 401 out of Windsor. Uh,
Yes. Yeah.
yeah,
Oh, you got Vivek now. You're gonna get them too.
yeah. What? Hold your horse on that one because we cannot do that topic justice. Okay, the longer this goes on, the more I'm gonna make
I
the
know.
more
Okay,
likely I am to
sir.
make that
Okay,
joke.
sir.
Because, and I gotta save it for the big episode because
Yes.
I'm really hyping this, but I think you guys will appreciate it.
Yeah.
But with that being said, not to get too much off on a tangent, that's really all I had for this week and a half.
Yes.
So thank you everyone once again for tuning in, and to everyone on the Gregorian calendar, I hope you had a very good Christmas. And to everyone on the Julian calendar, we haven't forgotten about you. And I suppose when that time comes, I hope you have a good Christmas as well. And I'll be sure to mention that at the time as well because I know the demographics of our audience. I know the demographics of my co-hosts. Uh, but in all regardless of whether you observed Christmas either this past week or are going to in the coming week, I hope it was either good or it will be good, and I hope everyone, of course, has a happy New Year as well. And we'll
Yes.
certainly see you on the other side of it with our great year in review, which is it's gonna be like a 5 hour long episode. But I'm looking forward to it. So thank you
Yep.
everyone once again for tuning in, and have a good one.
Goodbye, take care, and God bless.